So welcome to the first section, equipment and shooting. So to clear out the question I get asked the most, do I do my hyperlapse rotation crazy stuff while shooting? So I shoot my hyperlapses in a simple and basic way and do all the crazy editing stuff in post-production, which I'm going to show you later on. So there are basically two ways to shoot a hyperlapse. First being doing it with photos, and second being shooting a video. So I like to use the photo hyperlapse when I got like a fixed point to follow, like a corner or a building or the edge of a building or a clock tower. So this method is actually more time consuming, but it gives you the better quality. And I like to shoot video hyperlapses when I got like a small and narrow hallway. And I like to call this method hyperspeed, while I'm basically speeding through space and time. So I like to use this method more in a quick and dirty way. So let's clear out which equipment I use for my photo hyperlapse. From the camera perspective, it really doesn't matter which camera, but I would recommend a camera that shoots like raw photos. So me personally, I'm using the Sony a7S II. I know this is more of a video camera, but this 12 megapixel sensor gives me a resolution of around about 4000 by 3000 pixels, which is more than enough for my needs. But I'm actually not always using this camera for my hyperlapses. I often shoot my hyperlapses with my iPhone and the app called Lightroom, because Lightroom allows your phone to shoot raw images besides from the standard JPEG compressed images that your phone usually allows. So which lenses do I use for my camera? It really depends on the look you're going for. I usually like to shoot with a wide lens, so you capture more of the actual surroundings, but you can also shoot a more narrow hyperlapse, a more zoomed in hyperlapse with like a telephoto lens, which I used here on this clock hyperlapse, for example. So I set up my camera to shoot like the best available quality possible. It would be, in my case, the RAW format, so that I have plenty of playroom in post-production. I also always set up my photo grid so that I can align the track point every time I shoot a photo. So I like to close the aperture a bit down so I don't have this much depth of field, and plus my camera has an easier way to nail the focus every time. I set up my ISO as low as possible, and also my shutter is at least at 150 or at 1/100th. Also, I'm not shooting an automatic white balance. I like to set a fixed value for my white balance so that I don't have these color jumps later on in post-production. The last thing I set up is my focus. I like to use the autofocus mode, and I set up my focus point to be the same spot as my reference point. Speaking of reference point, choose a specific point on your building that you would like to track beforehand. Now try to align this point as close as possible on the same spot on your grid every time you make a new photo. So my way of actually shooting a hyperlapse is without using a tripod. I shoot everything handheld. So while traveling, I do not always have the time to put up a tripod, set up every photo perfectly. So I like to do it in a quick and dirty way with only my camera and my camera strap. And I stretch out my camera with my camera strap as far as I can so that I have the same distance, plus it gives me much more stability. So this is probably the most important thing while shooting a photo hyperlapse, is knowing the approximate path you want to go beforehand, before you actually go out and shoot. If you're shooting in a city, for example, there are really often ground markers on the ground, which you can just take and then follow their path. Also try to approximately measure out how many photos you're actually going to need. So let's take, for example, a video sequence of 24 frames per second. That equals 24 photos per second. So for 1 second of hyperlapse, you need 24 photos. So if you're going like for a 5-second hyperlapse in a 24 FPS timeline, it would equal 120 photos. And me personally, I like to shoot between 100 and 150 photos so that I have like 4 to 6 seconds of hyperlapse. Once you got the ground markers, what I do is take a photo, make a step forward, take a photo, make a step forward, and so on. Try to do it in the exact same timing. So for example, step, photo, step, photo. Otherwise, you will end up with these visually timed jumps in your hyperlapses, and these are really tricky and hard to fix it in post. So keep the exact timing every time. So that's basically it for the photo hyperlapse. Now let's talk about the video hyperlapse. Like I told you, it's different from photo hyperlapse because I like to use the video hyperlapse when I got like a straight line, a narrow hallway, and I'm basically hyper speeding through that hallway. It's a lot faster and not as time consuming, but the quality is usually not as good as shooting a photo hyperlapse. So an equipment that is essential is using some sort of a gimbal system. So me personally, I use the Ronin SE2, and for my smartphone I use the Osmo Mobile 4. But it really doesn't matter which brand of a gimbal system you're actually using. And of course you need some sort of a video camera. I recommend a video camera that shoots at least 4K. So the first step being setting up your camera in the best available quality and resolution. So in the case of my Sony a7S II or my iPhone 12, it would be 4K. And you will see why the resolution is actually really important when we jump into After Effects later on. As far as frame rates, shoot in a very low frame rate, like 24, 25 or 30. You don't need these high frame rates like 60 or 120 because we're going to speed up the entire video later on in posts either way. As far as my aperture, I like to shoot at least aperture 4, so I don't have that much depth of field. I like to have everything sharp and clear in the image. So for the shutter, just double your frame rate. So when you're shooting in 25, make it 1/50. Fix your white balance and then balance out the brightness of the image with your ISO. When you're shooting with a smartphone, make sure to lock also all your settings. You don't want to have these white balance or brightness jumps in your video footage. So in most cases, you actually need an external app for it to work because the native camera app in the iPhone, for example, doesn't let you fix your settings. So some apps I would recommend would be the DJI Mimo app or Filmic Pro app. In these apps, you can really adjust and lock all your settings. So now let's jump over to how I actually shoot my video hyperlapses. Once you got your camera balanced out on your gimbal, I like to shoot in a mode called locked mode. So the gimbal doesn't pan left or right. Almost every gimbal supports that in some way. So the next step is, again, choose your path beforehand. The straighter you go, the better the results. Avoid having these curvy lines, avoid going left or right. So the more straight the path is, the better the results will be. And then just simply start walking. It doesn't have to be fast, it doesn't have to be slow. Just make sure you stick to your own pace. At the end, I'll end up having a clip around 5 to 15 minutes. So one thing that I absolutely love on the run and gun is using my smartphone and the combination with the smartphone gimbal. So for example, for me, it would be the Osmo 4. So the Osmo in the combination with my smartphone actually allows me to track a subject, a building, a statue with just a click of a button. So I simply select the target on my iPhone screen and then I basically just start walking. The gimbal will now start the tracking automatically. This literally simplified my workflow in many ways. I know there are similar workarounds for bigger gimbals like my new Ronin SE2, where you can just basically attach a so-called Raven Eye. So it's basically the same system. You select the target on your iPhone screen and now the gimbal with the camera will track what you selected automatically for you. It's pretty handy, but I personally don't use it that much. So that's basically it for my settings and equipment. And as you see, I pretty shoot my hyperlapses in a normal, simple, standard way, and I do all my editing magic in post-production. In the next chapter, we finally jump into After Effects and I'm going to show you my entire workflow from scratch.